The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roasted chestnuts and freshly baked bread. The city buzzed with life. Street performers strummed guitars on cobblestone corners, couples strolled hand in hand, and tourists snapped photos of every landmark they passed. Among these visitors was Mark, a 29-year-old American traveler who had been dreaming of this trip for years. With his backpack slung over one shoulder and a camera dangling around his neck, he wandered through the vibrant streets, soaking in the charm of the historic capital. Mark wasn't alone in his adventure. He had spent most of the day exploring with a group of fellow travelers. By nightfall, however, the group had disbanded, leaving Mark to his own devices. He found himself drawn to a cozy pub tucked away in a narrow alley. Inside, the warm glow of lanterns illuminated wooden tables, filled with locals laughing and sharing stories. Feeling adventurous, Mark ordered drink after drink, savoring flavors he'd never experienced before. As the hours ticked by, his laughter grew louder, and his steps became less steady. By the time Mark stumbled out of the pub, the world seemed to spin just a little too fast. But instead of heading back to his hostel, curiosity pulled him toward the Grand Palace everyone had talked about all day. Its towering spires and golden accents shimmered under the moonlight, drawing crowds of admirers even at this late hour. Tourists gathered near the gates, cameras flashing as they tried to capture the beauty of the structure, and the stoic guards standing watch outside. These guards were legendary figures, known for their unwavering discipline and striking uniforms. Clad in bright red coats and bearskin hats, they stood like statues, unmoving no matter what happened around them. Children pointed excitedly, while adults whispered jokes about how they must have superhuman patience. For many, seeing the guards up close was a highlight of their visit. But for Mark, already several drinks deep, it sparked an idea, one that would prove disastrous. As he approached the gates, weaving slightly with each step, Mark's mind raced with thoughts of how funny it would be to mess with one of the guards. After all, they weren't allowed to react right. That made them the perfect target for a prank. His friends back home would love hearing about this story. Fueled by liquid courage and a misplaced sense of humor, Mark decided to test the limits of the guard's famous self-control. Little did he know, his actions would lead to consequences far greater than he could imagine. What started as harmless fun quickly escalated into something more reckless. Mark's confidence swelled with every cheer from the crowd, emboldening him to push boundaries further. But behind the guard's stoic expression lay years of training and a strict code of conduct, and breaking either came with a price. Unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, Mark took one final step forward, sealing his fate in a moment that would soon go down in infamy. The royal guard stood motionless, his posture impeccable despite the chaos swirling around him. His bright red coat and towering bearskin hat made him look almost larger than life, a symbol of tradition and discipline that had been passed down for generations. Tourists gathered in droves, snapping photos and marveling at his stoic demeanor. To them, he wasn't just a man. He was part of the city's charm, an unshakable figure who added to the magic of the historic palace. Mark, however, saw something different. Through his alcohol-fueled haze, the guard seemed less like a respected sentinel and more like a living statue begging to be tested. Grinning ear to ear, Mark staggered closer, weaving between onlookers until he was standing directly in front of the guard. The crowd murmured, some chuckling nervously while others whispered warnings. "Don't do it," one woman said softly, but her words were drowned out by the excitement rippling through the group. At first, Mark simply mimicked the guard's rigid stance, puffing out his chest and squaring his shoulders. He held his arms stiffly at his sides, trying, and failing, to suppress a smirk. A few people laughed, entertained by the drunken spectacle. Encouraged by their reaction, Mark leaned forward slightly, pretending to inspect the guard's uniform. "Nice hat," he slurred, his voice loud enough to turn heads. The guard didn't flinch, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if Mark didn't exist. But Mark wasn't done. Buoyed by the crowd's amusement, He decided to take things further. He struck exaggerated poses, waving his arms dramatically, and even attempting to salute the guard with sloppy precision. Each move drew louder laughter from the spectators, though some began to glance nervously at the guard, wondering how much more he'd tolerate. Cameras flashed nonstop, capturing every ridiculous moment as Mark grew bolder with each passing second. Then came the tipping point. Ignoring the growing unease among the onlookers, Mark stepped even closer, leaning toward the guard's earpiece as if sharing a secret. "You're doing great," he mumbled, his breath reeking of alcohol. He punctuated the comment with a laugh, clearly enjoying himself. But this time, there was no mistaking the subtle shift in the guard's expression. For the briefest moment, his jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation that went unnoticed by most, but sent a quiet ripple through the crowd. Still, Mark pressed on, oblivious to the tension building around him. He clapped his hands together mockingly, as if applauding the guard's performance. "Don't stop now," he shouted, eliciting scattered giggles from those watching. What started as harmless fun had crossed into dangerous territory, yet Mark showed no signs of backing down. The guard remained silent, his body taut with restraint, but it was clear that patience had its limits, and Mark was about to find out just how far they could stretch. The guard's stoic expression never wavered, but the faintest signs of tension began to show. His gloved hands, resting on the ornate rifle slung across his chest, tightened ever so slightly. The muscles in his jaw flexed as he clenched his teeth, a silent signal that Mark's antics were wearing thin. To the untrained eye, the guard still looked like an immovable statue, but those who paid close attention could sense something brewing beneath the surface, a storm held back by sheer discipline. Mark, however, was too deep into his own world to notice. His drunken bravado had reached its peak, and the cheers from the crowd only fueled his reckless behavior. He leaned closer again, this time pretending to adjust the guard's earpiece with exaggerated care. "There you go," he slurred, patting the side of the guard's hat as if congratulating him for a job well done. The crowd gasped audibly, some covering their mouths in disbelief, while others instinctively took a step back, sensing that things were about to escalate. For minutes that felt like hours, the guard endured it all without moving a muscle. But inside, frustration simmered just below the surface. Years of training had taught him to remain composed under any circumstance, no matter how provoking or absurd. Yet there was something uniquely maddening about being mocked by someone who clearly didn't understand or respect the gravity of his role. This wasn't just a uniform. It represented centuries of tradition, honor, and duty. And here was Mark, treating it like a prop in his personal comedy routine. A few members of the crowd tried to intervene, calling out cautiously to Mark. "Hey, maybe leave him alone," one man said, his tone laced with concern. Another woman added, "You're going too far." But Mark either didn't hear them or chose to ignore their warnings. Instead, he doubled down, laughing louder and gesturing wildly, as if putting on a performance. At one point, he even mimicked the guard's stance once more, exaggerating every movement to elicit more laughter from the bystanders. What Mark failed to realize was that the guard's silence wasn't permission, it was restraint. Every second he pushed further, the line between harmless fun and outright disrespect grew thinner. The atmosphere around them shifted subtly, the initial amusement giving way to discomfort. Some tourists began recording videos not because they found it funny anymore, but because they sensed the situation was spiraling out of control. And then, almost imperceptibly, the guard's posture changed. His feet shifted slightly, redistributing his weight. His fingers twitched against the rifle, a minuscule movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't watching closely. It was as if his body was preparing itself for what might come next. For the first time since Mark approached, the guard's eyes flickered, not toward Mark, but past him, scanning the crowd as though gauging the reaction to what he was about to do. The air seemed heavier now, charged with anticipation. The playful energy that had filled the space moments ago had transformed into something tense and uncertain. Mark, oblivious to the subtle cues, continued his act, completely unaware that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, or one final push, would tip the scales, and the consequences would be swift and unavoidable. Without warning, the guard moved. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that for a split second, the crowd didn't even register what had happened. One moment, he was standing as still as a statue. The next, he stepped forward with precision, his polished boots clicking sharply against the cobblestones. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence, freezing everyone in place. Mark, caught off guard by the movement, barely had time to react before it was too late. The guard's first action was subtle but deliberate. A swift stomp onto Mark's foot with the heel of his boot. The force wasn't enough to break bones, but it was more than enough to send a jolt of pain shooting through Mark's body. He yelped, staggering backward, his arms flailing as he tried to regain balance. But the guard wasn't done. In one fluid motion, he extended an arm and delivered a firm shove to Mark's chest, sending him sprawling onto the ground with a thud. Gasps erupted from the onlookers. Some covered their mouths in shock, while others instinctively took a step back, creating a wide circle around the scene. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every detail of the confrontation. Mark lay there for a moment, dazed and humiliated, his face flushed red, not just from the fall, but from the realization that his antics had finally pushed someone too far. For the first time all night, he was speechless. The guard, meanwhile, resumed his position as if nothing had happened. His expression remained neutral, his posture rigid and unyielding once again. If not for the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes, one might have thought the entire incident was imagined. Tourists exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh, applaud, or scold Mark for provoking such a response. A few murmured words of approval toward the guard, clearly feeling that Mark had gotten exactly what he deserved. Mark groaned as he sat up, his pride bruised almost as much as his body. His once confident grin was gone, replaced by a look of embarrassment and disbelief. He glanced around at the crowd, hoping for some sympathy, but found none. Instead, he saw smirks, raised eyebrows, and even a few people shaking their heads in disapproval. The same people who had laughed at his jokes earlier now seemed eager to distance themselves from him, as though being associated with his behavior might reflect poorly on them. As he scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt off his clothes, Mark muttered something under his breath. Whether it was an apology or a complaint, no one could tell. He shot a wary glance at the guard, who stood tall and unmoving, radiating authority. Whatever bravado Mark had left evaporated in that instant. Slowly, he backed away, keeping his eyes fixed on the guard as if afraid another move might provoke further retaliation. By now, the mood among the crowd had shifted entirely. What had started as lighthearted amusement had turned into a mix of awe and unease. Parents ushered their children away, whispering lessons about respecting boundaries and traditions. Others lingered, debating whether the guard's actions were justified or excessive. Regardless of where they stood, everyone agreed on one thing. Mark had crossed a line, and the consequences had been immediate and brutal. As Mark disappeared into the throng of tourists, limping slightly and avoiding eye contact, the guard stood tall, a silent reminder of the importance of discipline and respect. The palace gates loomed behind him, majestic and unshaken, just like the man guarding them. And though the incident would soon become the talk of the city, and eventually the internet, it was clear that the guard had sent a message loud and clear. Tradition demanded reverence, and disrespect came at a cost. Within hours, the incident had exploded across social media. Someone in the crowd had uploaded a video of the confrontation online, and it spread like wildfire. By morning, millions of people around the world had seen the clip of Mark's antics and the guard's swift retaliation. The footage was everywhere, shared on news websites, tweeted by influencers, and discussed in countless comment sections. Memes began popping up, with captions like, "When you disrespect tradition," or the guard who said enough is enough. Reactions were mixed, to say the least. Some viewers praised the guard for his restraint up until that point, calling him a hero for standing up to someone who clearly didn't understand the gravity of his actions. Good for him. One commenter wrote, "That guy deserved it for being so disrespectful." Others focused on the humor of the situation, laughing at how quickly Mark's bravado had crumbled when faced with real consequences. Clips of the moment he hit the ground were replayed endlessly, often set to comedic sound effects or dramatic music, but not everyone found it funny. A vocal segment of the internet criticized the guard's actions, arguing that shoving a tourist, even a drunk and obnoxious one, was unprofessional and unnecessary. "He's just doing his job," one person tweeted. "Why escalate things like that?" Others pointed out that Mark's behavior, while inappropriate, didn't justify physical force. Debates raged in comment threads, with users dissecting every detail of the encounter, from the guard's subtle jaw clench to the exact angle of the shove. Meanwhile, back home, Mark woke up to a flood of notifications on his phone. Friends and family members had sent messages asking if the man in the viral video was really him. At first, he tried to brush it off, muttering something about fake news and people exaggerating. But as he scrolled through post after post featuring his face, there was no denying it. He was the star of the show, and not in a good way. His attempt at humor had turned into a global spectacle, and now the entire world knew his name. Things got worse when local authorities stepped in. News outlets reported that officials were reviewing the incident, questioning whether Mark's behavior constituted disorderly conduct. Overnight, he went from being a carefree traveler to a potential legal headache. Reporters camped outside his hostel, eager to get a statement. Strangers stopped him on the street, some to scold him, others to ask for selfies. It was surreal and exhausting. As the days passed, the story continued to dominate headlines. Late-night talk show hosts joked about it, turning Mark into a punchline. One comedian quipped, "If you're gonna mess with royalty, at least bring your A game." Audiences roared with laughter, but for Mark, it wasn't funny anymore. He felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making, unable to escape the ridicule and judgment that followed him everywhere he went. Despite the backlash, some voices rose in defense of Mark. A few argued that while his actions were immature, they didn't warrant such harsh treatment. He was drunk, not dangerous. One article read, "Should we really ruin someone's life over a stupid mistake?" These opinions, though less popular, added fuel to the debate, keeping the conversation alive long after most viral stories would have faded away. By the end of the week, it was clear that this incident wasn't just a fleeting moment of embarrassment. It was a cultural phenomenon. People couldn't stop talking about the drunk tourist and the stoic guard, dissecting every angle of what had happened. For better or worse, both men had become symbols, one of recklessness, the other of discipline. And as the world weighed in, Mark realized the hardest truth of all. His journey was far from over. The fallout from the incident hit Mark harder than he could have imagined. Back in his small hometown, where everyone knew everyone, the video had made its rounds. Friends who once laughed at his travel stories now avoided eye contact when they saw him at the grocery store. Family members called to express their disappointment, reminding him how his actions reflected not just on himself, but on the family name. Even his coworkers, who weren't exactly known for being sensitive, made snide comments about royal guards and drunken tourists. It seemed like there was no escaping the weight of what he'd done. But the real consequences came when authorities stepped in. The local police contacted Mark, informing him that he was under investigation for disorderly conduct and public disturbance. To make matters worse, the country where the incident occurred took the matter seriously. Their tourism board issued a formal statement condemning Mark's behavior and announced that he would be banned from entering the nation again. For someone who loved traveling and exploring new places, this felt like a punch to the gut. Worse still, they slapped him with a hefty fine, a financial blow that left him scrambling to figure out how to pay it off. Public opinion didn't help either. As the days went by, more people weighed in on the incident, dissecting every detail of Mark's actions. Some argued that while drunk antics were embarrassing, they shouldn't define a person forever. Others insisted that mocking a cultural institution like the Royal Guard was unacceptable, no matter the circumstances. Mark found himself stuck in the middle of these debates, unable to defend himself without drawing even more attention to the situation. Every time he thought things might calm down, another wave of criticism would surge online, keeping the story alive longer than anyone expected. Feeling cornered and humiliated, Mark decided to issue a public apology. Sitting in front of his laptop, he typed out a heartfelt message explaining that his behavior had been irresponsible and disrespectful. He admitted that he hadn't understood the significance of the guard's role until it was too late and promised to learn from his mistakes. When he posted the statement online, reactions were mixed. Some appreciated his honesty and willingness to take responsibility, while others dismissed it as an insincere attempt to save face. Either way, the apology did little to quell the storm surrounding him. What hurt most, though, was realizing how much damage he'd caused, not just to himself, but to others. His friends back home told him stories of how people were using the incident to stereotype Americans as rude and entitled travelers. Strangers commented on social media threads, saying things like, "This is why we need stricter rules for tourists." Mark hated seeing his nationality dragged through the mud because of his poor choices. It wasn't fair, but deep down, he knew he only had himself to blame. As weeks turned into months, the initial frenzy began to die down, but the scars remained. Mark stopped sharing photos of his travels on social media, fearing mockery or judgment. He avoided conversations about trips abroad, dreading the inevitable questions about the infamous night. Slowly, life returned to some semblance of normalcy, but the lessons he learned stayed etched in his mind. The experience taught him that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences can follow you far beyond the moment itself. Months after the incident, Mark found himself sitting alone in his apartment, staring at a blank notebook. The chaos of the past few months had finally quieted down, but the weight of what he'd done still lingered. He couldn't shake the image of the guard's stoic face or the sound of the crowd gasping as he fell to the ground. It replayed in his mind like a loop, a constant reminder of how easily arrogance and alcohol could lead to poor decisions. But instead of letting shame consume him, Mark decided it was time to do something meaningful with the experience. He began researching responsible tourism, diving into articles and documentaries about how travelers could respect local cultures and traditions. What he discovered shocked him. There were countless stories of tourists causing harm, whether by vandalizing landmarks, disrespecting sacred sites, or simply behaving recklessly without understanding the impact of their actions. Mark realized he wasn't alone in making mistakes, but that didn't excuse what he'd done. If anything, it made him more determined to turn his misstep into a lesson for others. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Mark stumbled upon an organization dedicated to promoting ethical travel practices. Their mission resonated deeply with him. They worked to educate tourists about cultural sensitivity and encouraged them to leave positive footprints wherever they went. Inspired, Mark reached out to the group, explaining his story and asking if there was any way he could contribute. To his surprise, they welcomed him with open arms, seeing his willingness to share his experience as an opportunity to reach a wider audience. Over time, Mark became involved in workshops and community events hosted by the organization. At first, standing in front of a room full of people and recounting the night of the incident felt excruciating. His voice would tremble, and he'd avoid making eye contact, worried about being judged. But as he spoke more, he noticed something remarkable. People listened. They didn't just hear his words, they connected with them. Many shared their own stories of moments when they'd acted thoughtlessly while traveling, admitting they hadn't considered the consequences until hearing Mark's tale. Mark also started writing articles for travel blogs, offering tips on how to be a respectful visitor in foreign countries. He emphasized simple yet crucial advice. Learn about local customs before you go, Ask permission before taking photos, and always treat others with kindness and humility. In one piece, he wrote candidly about the Royal Guard incident, describing the moment he realized his behavior had crossed a line. "I thought I was being funny," he admitted, "but I was actually being selfish and ignorant. That night taught me that respecting traditions isn't just polite, it's essential." His efforts began to gain traction. People started reaching out to thank him for his honesty and vulnerability, saying his story inspired them to reflect on their own travel habits. Teachers even used his articles in classrooms to spark discussions about cultural awareness. Slowly but surely, Mark transformed from the laughingstock of the internet into someone who made a difference, one awkward presentation and heartfelt article at a time. Through this journey, Mark learned something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about using it to create change. He knew he'd never fully escape the shadow of that infamous night, nor did he deserve to. But by owning his mistake and working to educate others, he found a sense of purpose he'd never expected. For the first time since the incident, Mark felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the impact he could have on the world around him. Years passed, and the memory of that fateful night at the palace gates began to fade from public consciousness. The viral video of Mark's drunken antics and the guard's firm response was eventually buried under newer, flashier headlines. But for Mark, the lessons he'd learned stayed with him every single day. What started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into a turning point, a catalyst for growth that shaped the person he became. Mark continued his work with the travel organization, traveling to schools, community centers, and conferences to share his story. His presentations evolved over time, becoming less about shame and more about empowerment. He spoke passionately about the beauty of cultural exchange and the importance of approaching new places with humility and respect. Audiences responded to his authenticity, often approaching him after talks to express gratitude or ask questions. "You've made me think twice about how I travel," one listener told him after a workshop. Those words meant more to Mark than any applause ever could. In addition to speaking engagements, Mark wrote a book titled Lessons from the Palace Gates. It wasn't just a recounting of his infamous night. It was a guide filled with practical advice on responsible tourism, personal anecdotes, and reflections on how small actions can have big impacts. The book received positive reviews, with readers praising its honesty and relatability. "I didn't expect to connect so deeply with someone who once acted so recklessly," one reviewer wrote. But Mark's story reminds us that everyone makes mistakes, and that we all have the power to learn from them. Back home, Mark noticed a shift in how people treated him. While some still whispered behind his back, many others greeted him warmly, proud of what he'd accomplished despite his rocky past. Friends who had distanced themselves during the height of the scandal slowly reconnected, impressed by his determination to make amends. Even his family softened their stance, acknowledging that he'd turned a negative chapter into something meaningful. Though the scarlet letter of embarrassment would always linger, Mark no longer felt defined by it. Meanwhile, far away in the historic capital where the incident occurred, life went on as usual. The royal guards continued their duties, standing tall and unwavering outside the palace gates. To tourists snapping photos, they remained symbols of tradition and discipline, untouchable figures frozen in time. Occasionally, someone might recognize the spot where Mark's infamous encounter took place, but the story itself faded into legend, retold in hushed tones as a cautionary tale. For Mark, redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about proving that people can change. He didn't seek forgiveness from the guard or the country that banned him. Instead, he focused on earning back the respect of those around him through consistent effort and genuine care. And while he never returned to the city where it all happened, he often thought about the guard who had delivered that swift, unforgettable lesson. In a way, Mark owed him a debt of gratitude, not for the shove, but for forcing him to confront the consequences of his behavior. As years turned into decades, Mark looked back on his journey with pride. He hadn't just survived the storm of ridicule and judgment. He had thrived in spite of it. By embracing accountability and using his experience to help others, he carved out a legacy far greater than the blunder that nearly derailed his life. And though the world may never forget the drunk tourist who mocked a royal guard, they came to know him not for his mistake, but for the man he chose to become afterward, a testament to resilience, reflection, and the power of second chances.